grab it, pull the trigger, turn it on, hold it for 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds, depending on activity or what you're doing. And then as you're hot, that heat just keeps coming through your hands. Device is going to suck out a bunch, and then cooler blood's going to recirculate through. So it's just that sort of active cooling process.
We are live, Braeden. This is another episode of the Constant Sports Podcast, and we're changing the way athletes cool down. Is the easy way to put it, Braeden. So thanks for joining us today. And are you joining us from north part of the border here, I believe?
Yeah, that's right. Well, Connor, thanks. I appreciate it. I'm excited to chat. And yes, from the northern side of the border where it's not quite as hot, but it's hot enough these days.
Yeah, you got that right. Yeah, and kind of going off of that is, the hot and overheating. That's kind of the sweet spot of where the company you founded is. Kind of been on this entrepreneur journey. Then obviously being, an engineer, being a former professional hockey player, national championship, champion winner, and then I believe where I read university valedictorian. So we've got kind of best of both worlds here, bronze and brains going for Braeden. So we're going to dive in here, and he's the founder of Kühler Technologies, company developing this portable palm cooling technology to improve human performance. And so let's I'll stop it right there and have you kind of fill in any blank spots there, Braeden.
Hey, well, you did a great job, and you make me sound far more impressive than I think I am. So, yeah, good background. Academically studied mechanical engineering, so bring an engineering mindset and just a love and a passion for problems, especially of the technical nature, which is suitable, I think, if you're going to be an entrepreneur and try and build new products, especially hardware-centric products in the space that we're in as well. And as you mentioned, played hockey growing up, so that was, the biggest passion I had, and that's what really got me into the sports world. And getting into cooler technologies and what we're doing now, the real driving enthusiasm behind it was having been an athlete first and having been in high performance environments and been exposed to really, really talented athletes, really, really exceptional trainers and coaches, on strength and sports performance side, as well as athletic training and sports medicine side. And then just the evolving landscape of sports technology and recovery technology in parallel with the broader biohacking wellness, initiatives that we see now. And I just happened to the way my worlds converged, where I was able to take the technical and academic background I had and then apply it into a use case where I've lived in that world and seen it. And that's where we're at now. It's still hopefully in the early days of the journey and a long ways to go. But yeah, no, it's a great background. I appreciate you pumping my tires there.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Well, you got so much going on here. I had to. Is and I always enjoy hearing, especially professional athletes kind of getting into the business world. We're seeing a lot of lately, and so can you kind of speak to that? As different experiences you've had kind of as an athlete, obviously shaping to being the entrepreneur, being the businessman you are now. What are kind of some of those parallels?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, there are a lot of parallels and there's not. I mean, I'd say there's, if anything that comes to mind immediately, I'd say there's one super parallel and one super contrast. And the parallel is the just resilience to deal with adversity and ride the emotional roller coaster. When you're an athlete, you're going to have a good game, you're going to have a bad game, you're going to have good play and a bad play. So you could have real micro timelines, but also entire seasons. But if you are constantly riding the emotional roller coaster, it's just going to suck the life out of you. And you look at, the world's best athletes, just their composure and their resilience to just stay so even keeled, even when you feel like you're just dropping down, rock bottom and chewing glass and staring into the abyss, as opposed to there's times where you feel like you feel like you're Napoleon in the, taking over all of Europe sometimes. And you have to do that with entrepreneurship as well, because starting a business, everything is uncertain, and there's definitely an element of luck and there's an element of outside forces. But you just sort of have to sign up for the fact that you're probably going to fail a lot and you're going to get rejected a lot and there's going to be new things and you're doing things that you've never done before. And in sports, it's sort of the same when you go to a higher level. I mean, you're pushing yourself to a new threshold that, I haven't been here before. Everything is new until you've gotten to the point, until you get to the point where you're retired in the Hall of Fame. I mean, you're always going to be challenged and pushed.
Yeah.
So I think a really major and significant benefit of being an athlete is if you learn to manage your emotions and you learn to just ride the highs and lows and try to stay even keel throughout. I think that's really transferable to entrepreneurship because you're just going to get slapped in the face over and over again. So the better you can handle that. And in my case specifically, I was a goalie. So, if I make a mistake, it could cost us the game.
Everyone knows, yeah.
everyone knows there's no hiding from it. I mean, you can't just, hope that someone didn't see that thing. I mean, usually it ends up with a bright red light behind you and a bunch of people yelling and screaming. Um, but, you also learn to realize that over the course of a game, maybe there's 30 shots. And then you put that over 40, 50 games, and then you put that over multiple seasons, and you realize, I mean, each mistake is one out of, 10,000 attempts. And the best goalies aren't making every save. They're most consistently aggregated over, a longer period of time. So you just kind of have to just remind yourself, all right, that play's done, and on to the next one. Now, the interesting thing, though, about the sport world, at least I think in the context of a specific game versus entrepreneurship, and this has been almost a struggle at times, is in sport, like when you're in the game, things happen very fast. So a lot of it is reactionary. You put in all this time and effort into practice, and then you allow yourself to get into the moment and your instincts take over. And, if you've done the work, you just sort of, if you can get in that flow state, play and respond. And that's when athletes are really at their best. But things happen really, really fast. And in a lot of sports, just these tiny little differences of inches or milliseconds or a reaction just slightly too late or something unexpected happens, with involving other players in the game, just things beyond your control or bounces, things like that. So that's this very acute moment to moment wins and losses that you respond to. Whereas in the business world, uh, it's just very vague and long term. So if you're trying to put together a business, or like, hey, here's our strategy of how we're going to build this thing. I mean, that could be 12 months down the road, and you have no idea. Everything that you're like, well, I think it should be this way, and maybe this component should do this, and you have no idea. And the feedback loop is so slow. Or if you have a business model and you're trying to say, like, I think we could sell to this customer demographic and have success, you're not going to know for, 12, 24 months if that was actually a good idea. Whereas, in sports, it's usually seconds to milliseconds being like, oh, I got that one wrong or I got that one right, and then
Yeah,
we can
that didn't
adjust.
work.
So you have to be very comfortable in the ambiguity because there's just so much uncertainty and these long time horizons and you're kind of guessing. And if it's a new business, there's not as clear of guardrails of what you should do. There's good frameworks, there's good analogous businesses, there's lots you can learn from talking to people and studying history. But your specific business and your specific product and your specific customer messaging is all going to be, N of one. And so that roadmap you have to figure out on your own. Whereas, in a sport, yes, every game and every play is going to be a little bit different, but it's still very constrained rules. And you have a very, very good idea of what's going to happen. Here's the realm of possible scenarios I'm going to have to be prepared for. And then in business, it's a little bit different. So in that way, I found that's been a lot more challenging. So you really have to change your framework to a lot of just, you really don't know. You're just walking down a path full of fog and you just hope that
Hoping
the
it's a
fog clears at some
yeah,
point. Yeah.
yeah, right,
And it often doesn't. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and then kind of go down that road a little bit too. Obviously, being a founder here, so obviously you saw a problem. We're trying to figure out the solution, and that's kind of where Cooler Technologies came up. And so, kind of what was that like as far as first finding the problem and then saying, okay, how are we going to solve it, or how that idea come to fruition?
Yeah, that's great. So after I stopped playing hockey, I got really into world of biohacking, fitness, podcasts, research articles, just sort of filling in the gap and interest level because I was
Yeah,
always still interested in performance, but I just took more of an academic curiosity to it, I guess you could say. And it was around 2021, Huberman Lab came out with his podcast, and he was the first probably really high profile person to start talking about palm cooling, which is the space that we built into. And he had a podcast talking about it. I thought it was interesting. And then he had a second podcast where he brought in Dr. Craig Heller, who was one of the Stanford researchers that was the first research group behind palm cooling. This goes back about 20 years ago. And then I got super interested in it. And at the time, they had a product come out that was part of their technology transfer, which I think it was the only one at the time. So this 2021, a lot of products started coming out shortly after that, but this was really sort of the pioneering product. And they had this awesome solution to where you could cool your body rapidly through your palms. Your palms just have optimal vasculature and skin type for heat transfer, so you can cool your core quickly, kind of like a radiator in a car. And they had this thing, and it worked fantastic. They had great researches, kind of a mitt you put your hand into. It's got some tubes coming out. It's got a separate um, container with ice and water, and it just circulates the fluids. But it was big and it was bulky and it was expensive, and I wanted to try it, but it just didn't fit my needs as a consumer, as a person in fitness. And then it was just a little bit later I had the idea. I was thinking, you could probably accomplish the same end goal using electronics, similar to what you have in consumer electronics, like in your computer. You got a heat sink, you got all these different electrical components. It's a becomes an engineering problem of heat dissipation. So you don't have to necessarily use water or ice as the only way to achieve cooling across an interface. And so then it just sort of got my brain running and thinking, really the whole concept of palm cooling is hot blood from your core comes in high density into your hands. You just have this interface, and all we're trying to do is take thermal energy from here and just, move it across
Yeah.
this border, right? And if I just take my hand as it is right now, convective heat transfer against the air, it's really limited. There's just only so much it could do. But if you had conductive heat transfer, you have contact with a metal, you can go really fast. And then it becomes, okay, well now how do we get it from here into this other interface, and how do we sufficiently dissipate it into the environment so we can keep a steady flow? And at that point, it just really became an engineering problem. But heat sink design, airflow design, thermoelectric coolers, different types of technologies have been in use for a long time in different consumer electronics, and they're improving consistently, especially as AI as an industry grows, because compute and demand and just thermal management is becoming more important on consumer devices, not just on the, you hear about the data centers, but also on the consumer electronics. So it just seemed as though there's an opportunity, and the North Star for building the product was really, how can I make something as convenient as possible to the person, where it's maximum portability, minimum size, and still accomplish the intent of rapidly moving heat across that barrier. And so that was sort of the origin story. And I think it's a good thing I studied mechanical engineering in school. To be honest, I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't really have that much of a passion for it in class, at least. But I had to take multiple heat transfer and thermodynamics classes, so it planted deeply enough to say, oh, I think you could just try this thing. And then it just started with a series of prototypes, experimenting, putting things together, and being like, does this work? And actually, the very first test I did was I went to a hardware store and I bought some copper pipe fittings, and I just put them in the fridge. And then I was doing push-ups with rest breaks, and I had an Excel spreadsheet set up, and I was just holding these little copper pipe fittings versus not. And it was hard to weed out placebo, but I kept noticing a strong enough effect with a extraordinarily rudimentary solution
Yeah.
to say, okay, there is legitimacy here. And then as I expanded just with further prototyping and further testing and further research, and also better understanding of the physiological mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms of what's happening in the body with fatigue, both locally in muscles as well as centrally with the nervous system. And it just became so clear that there was something here. And it's just been, slowly trying to figure out solve iterative problems along the way, both in terms of the technical product side as well as the business and go-to-market side, and
Yeah.
still trying to do that day to day.
Yeah, yeah, no, I love it, and I think the first time we talked a few months ago and whatnot, and it just made me thinking. Obviously we're talking about the product and kind of what you're building, but like growing up, me and my brothers, playing some hot summer game or something. Like your mom throws you a wet towel, she's like, "Yeah, put it over your head." And you like put it over your head, and you're like, "It's still hot as hell out here. Like I don't know if
Yeah.
this isn't getting it done." And so to think that this type of thing was in the works, and really the heat. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of affects in theory it affects the muscles, right? And then also affects the brain in a certain way, I'm assuming.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a couple different ways. So you could look at it locally, like you had said first. So locally, there's really a limit to what the body temperature can handle to be optimal. And one of the ways of looking at it is, the conversion of ATP and the generation locally in the muscle is dependent on enzymes. And enzymes are proteins by nature, and that facilitate reactions. So like if you're going to create ATP, you need to have pyruvate kinase as an enzyme. But they have a natural temperature curve where once they start to go above about 40 Celsius, then they start to denature and they break down. So these compounds have temperature thresholds where they'll be optimal or not optimal. So if you get extremely hot locally in the muscle, you can start to have reduced activity of the enzyme. So there can be effects there. But I think with elevated body temperature and core temperature, from my read on the literature, it seems that the primary inhibitor on performance is centrally regulated by the nervous system. So the way the body's nervous system works, and there's the what's called the governor theory or governor model of fatigue. So like the governor on a car, where it's your car could go faster, but it's like no 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 no, like this is your limit. You're gonna break
Yeah,
something. Like you can't go past this. And the brain kind of does the same thing when there are deviations that are significant from homeostasis, and this could be core temperature if it's too high or too low, from what would be your baseline core temperature. It could also be pH level if your pH is too high or too low. The body will start to shut down and say like, whoa, 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 we can't do this anymore. So when core temperature rises too high, the brain perceives it as a threat, being like, if you keep this up, you're gonna
it's
kill us.
over
Like
with.
we're
Yeah.
we're gonna die. And that is possible. I mean, you will eventually die, from fever, from going too hot. And so then what it does is it induces volitional fatigue where you start feeling tired where you just can't go harder. Like, if you're running outside, it's hot, you can't go faster. You're just missing something. You feel like you're capped at 80% or 70%. That's the nervous system basically down regulating neuromuscular output. So,
We need to chill.
what they found is in heat stress or in hyperthermic states is that your ability to contract your muscles, neuromuscular pathway is inhibited because the body's saying, well, I know that if you keep working this hard with this intensity, you're going to generate this much metabolic heat, and we're just going to keep getting hotter and hotter.
Yeah.
So the idea is if you can cool your core, or keep your core temperature in that optimal threshold, then the brain isn't shutting down as quickly. So you might still have the capacity in terms of oxygen or glycogen or other aspects of your body, like muscular, like you might physically have the capacity where you can do more work and go harder. But if you're just too hot, then, and this is why you see performance drop significantly running any sport like really outside hot environments or humid environments, performance just tanks because that becomes your ceiling. So if you can then raise that ceiling, then your failure point might be something else, or it could still be temperature, but maybe your ceiling's a little higher before you hit that point where performance tanks.
I see, I see, I see. Okay, gotcha. And then, so then obviously, then now walk us through cooler. So we kind of have the heat obviously being the problem and the main inhibitor there, and then some of the
Yeah,
cooler obviously with the palm cooling and kind of where you're at now.
yeah, sure. So I'll just start with quickly physiology because it just sort of sets the ground for cooler. So when your body overheats, there's two main ways of cooling down. The first is sweating, which is pretty common. The second is vasodilation. So the body will naturally redirect blood flow to the extremities. And then you have your palms of your hands, your soles of your feet, and your upper face are what's called glabrous skin. And these are high density vasculature regions that get a lot of blood flow and they're optimal for heat transfer. So the premise is if you start overheating and as you start overheating, you're going to have a lot of blood flow through your hands. And so that's when introducing palm cooler or what we have, or palm cooling, I should say, or we have cooler here. This is when you would apply this intervention. So you've got a lot of hot blood from your core flowing into your hands. This entire device here is metal. It's got a cooling plate inside, so you grab it, hold it, and turn it on. And then what's happening is you have all that contact area
On your
is in
body.
contact with the metal, and then you've got the cooling plate on there. So that's going to allow the heat coming into your hand to then come out, get sucked basically into the device. And then the device has got a cooling fan, it's got a heat sink, and it's got an air channel running through it. So it's then taking all that heat that's coming in, distributed over a larger surface area internally, and then blowing air over it to help dissipate it out of the device. So the actual, let's say, implementation or use of this is just grab it, pull the trigger, turn it on, hold it for 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds, depending on activity or what you're doing. And then as you're hot, that heat just keeps coming through your hands. Device is going to suck out a bunch, and then cooler blood's going to recirculate through. So it's just that sort of active cooling process. And you could do two hands. You have more surface area. You could do one hand. The specific protocol, let's say, would vary depending on sport, circumstance, time. It could vary a lot, but that's the principle is you would use that, and it's just going to help to dissipate heat, extract heat, dump heat, whatever terminology you want to use, as quickly as possible, and just regulate. And then if you're doing, let's say it's a longer duration activity, or you have a series of intermittent rest breaks between it, and you do a minute here, but you do that 10, 15 times throughout, you accumulate a significant amount of excess heat that you're able to dump out during those periods of time. So that's the premise behind the product and the technology. And as you can see here, it's pretty small. It's one hand. It weighs less than a pound. It's battery powered. So that's basically where we're at.
Okay, I like it. And then is that so? I guess the ideal customer is anyone who's in theory overheating. Professional athletes, I guess military,
Yeah. Well, yeah.
CrossFit.
In theory, I'd love to tell you the ideal customer is about 8 billion people, but that's probably not a good strategy. Yeah. No, the ideal. I'd say there's a few characteristics that make this most applicable. The first would be high intensity activity because the number one driver of heat stress is metabolic heat generation, more so than environmental heat generation. So you could be playing basketball indoors in a nice, air conditioned or room temperature building, but it doesn't take long for you to just be dripping sweat because you're just going with such intensity for so long. Um, so the number one is if you're doing really high intensity activity of any shape or size, but that's the primary driver. Your metabolic activity just goes through the roof because you got to remember that our bodies and just thermodynamics in general is super inefficient. So I mean, like 80% of metabolic energy is heat. So if you're working hard, you are generating a lot of heat. So
Yeah,
that's number
just
one.
right off the bat. Yeah.
The second part would be environmental conditions. So you're more prone to heat stress in hot and humid environments. And now, interestingly, though, the hot and humid environments, like, we just saw the World Cup and there's a lot of hot things going on, and a lot of tennis tournaments lately have had a lot of heat and a lot of issues. But there's not really a lot of actual heating or overheating due to the environment. There's a little bit of passive heating, but like, think about it if you're in an infrared sauna, it could be, 140, but it still takes a long time to really get hot. As opposed to, I could get myself sweating faster just by running in an air-conditioned room than by sitting in an infrared sauna. So there's a little bit of passive heating from a hot environment, but the biggest variable or factor or influence of the hot and humid environments is the inability to cool down naturally. So those hot environments are less about heating you up. It's more so about your body just can't cool down because if it's really humid, that really, really inhibits the ability for cooling via sweating because the primary mechanism of sweating is evaporative cooling. And if there's high humidity, then the effectiveness of sweating is really low. That's why humidity will just kill you in the heat because you can barely cool down. And then alternatively, if the ambient environment's also hotter, your natural convective or conductive heat transfer or radiation as well with the environment is lessened because the temperature gradient's smaller. So I guess the things I think about first is high intensity activity, which drives your overheating, hot and humid environments, which decreases your ability to cool down and regulate. And then the third point where I'd say palm cooling is most optimal is just the structure of the sport. Do you have rest breaks? Do you have dedicated periods where you can actually stop and interface with some sort of device or methodology where you can actually cool down? Whereas if you're playing soccer, if you're playing, or you're doing endurance running, unless you want to hold it in your hands, it's going to be a lot harder to implement just based on feasibility. But if you play, basketball and you have timeouts and you have breaks or you're on the bench, if you play tennis and you got breaks between games and sets, different sports like that, then that would be more optimal as well. Or, just could be as simple as weightlifting or bodybuilding where you say, hey, I take, 120 seconds between each set. Um, but I'd say those would be the three variables where you'd see the best bang for your buck is high intensity, hot environments, certainly an enhancement, but then also just does the activity allow for these interventions, and ideally proactively and repeatedly throughout.
And then one thing, this might be a dumb question, but as far as kind of like youth, amateur pro athletes, does the body type or body, like if a kid's 75 pounds, are they gonna, get hotter or cooler opposed to like a professional athlete that's 6'2", 240 or something?
No, that is a good question. So body weight does contribute to metabolic heat production. So generally, just the heavier you are, the more heat you produce. So it does affect it definitely. If you're younger, you'd probably have less of an effect. I would imagine it's not a primary driver, but there's certainly some scale. But to your point on size, there's been studies on exertional heat illness, especially in football, and of the major heat illness events. I don't want to butcher the stat, but I think it was almost 99% of severe events were with linemen in football,
Yeah.
as opposed to position players. But higher body weight has higher metabolic demands. So that would be the strongest correlation. So that is a good question, and it is relevant. You're less likely to see the extreme heat issues with smaller individuals.
Just got me thinking, just for just use cases for athletes and kind of all the above. But as you've been building this, what are kind of some, I guess, misconceptions or whatnot as you've been going out, pitching the company or talking to others about kind of palm cooling, kind of this entire concept?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been a few. Probably the one that's most frequently come up in professional circles and in literature too is this idea that, you know, I think there's a misconception that palm cooling is like a magic pill because there were a lot of highly glorified research studies, and when Stanford first came out, I think it was like 2008 or something, they had a nice headline written, better than steroids. Um, with now there's asterisks. I mean, in a certain context defining outcome, they're able to substantiate that claim, but there's guardrails around that. It's not just purely better than steroids. Although you could argue, if you're on the side of steroids not being good for you, then that might not be a difficult argument to make. But so there's been this idea and this misconception of people like, oh, people are just saying palm cooling's like magic. You're just gonna get super jacked and strong.
Yeah.
And it's well, no. Palm cooling when you're overheating can help you to perform better by alleviating heat-related fatigue, by alleviating the limiter of your performance. And there is plenty of literature. I mean, easily 20 plus studies showing that when an individual is heat stressed and their core temperature is elevated and they're doing high volume work and they properly implement palm cooling, that they have significant increases in exercise capacity and volume, where it truly is incredible what it can do. And it's really just basic physics, heat transfer in and out of the hands, and biology of just how the human body works in relation to temperature. But then if someone will say, oh, well, it's just supposed to magically work, so I'm going to go do bench press and I'm just going to hold these things in my hand and I should be able to do 200% more. It's like, well, it doesn't work that way. You have to have certain conditions for the effectiveness. If you're not experiencing some heat-related fatigue or have an elevated core temperature, it's not just going to magically improve your performance. I think an analogy I've come up with is it's like giving Tylenol to someone with no headache. It's not going to just make you it's not gonna help you if you don't have the affliction in the first place, or given a nice electrolyte and hydration beverage to someone who's fully hydrated.
Yeah.
It's not gonna. So there's been a few studies that have come out that have basically said, oh, well, palm cooling doesn't work, and their study conditions had almost no warm up, almost no intensity, no measure of core temperature, and they were in a 19 degrees Celsius room, with 5 minutes between single sets. So it's like, well, there's clearly no evidence, or even some that they show core temperature was like 37.19 Celsius. And it's like, well, that's not even, I mean, that's basically baseline. So there is no
Yeah.
heat stress there. So I'd say that's the first one is understanding that it's not a magic pill. It is an intervention for a specific time and place when heat is becoming an issue. Um, and that definitely requires some education. I think that's something that we've had to work on as well. The other thing that goes back and forth is understanding, it doesn't need to be extraordinarily cold. And there's a conversation about if it's too cold, you can vasoconstrict because you have really sensitive nerve signals, thermoreceptors in your hands and cold. And then if you detect ice in your hands, you're going to start to vasoconstrict, which is why in winter you get frostbite in your toes and fingers. Um, but I've heard a lot of commentary about the most important thing for palm cooling is you have this certain perfect temperature of interface that you put into your hand. And I think that's a bit misleading. Well, I think it's definitely misleading because the contact temperature with your hand and therefore the temperature gradient is only one of multiple variables that influences rate of heat transfer. And really the fundamental goal is to take the most amount of thermal energy as possible. So it's not about temperature, it's not even necessarily about heat rate, it's about total heat volume. And contact temperature is one of multiple variables that influences it. So there's a curve and there's an optimal. You want to have the optimal temperature, but there's no binary hard cutoff saying if you're not in this threshold range, then
It's not
it's
going to
it's
work.
useless.
Yeah.
Because in theory, I could be holding metal in my hands that's 80 Fahrenheit, which is warm. But you have a temperature gradient with your skin that's, let's say, 93, and conductive heat transfer into metal with a 13-degree temperature gradient is still faster than having my hand cooling in a 60-degree Fahrenheit air because convective heat transfer is orders of magnitude less. So the idea of temperature being the above all, beyond all, solution, I think is a little bit misleading. Now, the other point is a lot of those numbers, it's usually 50 to 60 Fahrenheit, maybe 50 to 55, depending on who you ask, or 57, was based on initial Stanford research. But there's, also a couple studies with 30, 40 participants, and, human physiology and just variability from people is so high. So that's the other thing is I'd say temperature matters. You want it cool. You don't want it too cold. But it's also not the be all end all. You don't have to live and die on
Okay.
the
Yeah.
hill
That's
of
also
temperature.
nice. Yeah.
Your whole point is, the bottom line, the most important thing is my performance is suffering because there's too much heat in my body. So the fundamental first principles objective is just get heat out of my body. So you don't want to put up more guardrails than that. And then the question is, okay, well, how do I get as much heat out as fast as possible? And then you start optimizing for that. But, holding room temperature metal with no technology in it is still going to be better than doing nothing until it reaches a saturation point. So that's something worth noting. The other thing that's actually worth saying is I think it's easy to discount subjective feelings, but placebo's real, subjectivity's real, psychology is real, and there was one interesting study that came out last year with baseball pitchers, and they had them put their hands in water it was relatively cool. I think it was around 50 or 60. It might have been, I think, 10 Celsius. It might have been about 50 Fahrenheit water, and they had them submerge their hands for 3 minutes between bouts of throwing fastballs, and they ended up breaking it up into two groups. There's one group that subjectively felt fine, no discomfort. The water was fine. It all felt good. And their mean velocity, average velocity, peak velocity, everything improved. But then there was a second group in the same water that subjectively noted some degree of discomfort or pain from their hand in the water, and their performance went down. So I wouldn't discount comfort, and I wouldn't, everything in any type of intervention in sports or health or wellness has to fit into your lifestyle and your enjoyment. So, science is a good guide, good roadmap, but you got to have some degree of practicality and flexibility as well, and just remember what's the ultimate goal, and are we moving closer towards that goal or not. So that was a long-winded way of discussing a few different things that I've noticed.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. Yeah, I was picking up a lot of good gold nuggets in there, but it just had me thinking of all the different athletes and different use cases. And I know you guys kind of had a bigger rollout a little while ago, and I believe you sold out. Is that correct?
Yeah, we sold out of our first production run. We've got our second one underway, and we've gotten some pre-orders. So it's been positive, definitely, because it took a lot of work to get the product built and get the supply chain and get the manufacturing and working through a lot of different things. So we're really grateful for all the different customers and users we have across many different sports, which has been pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was kind of one of my last questions here, as far as you've kind of have your second rollout here, but as far as athletes and use cases, obviously the positive feedback you're getting is surprised, not surprised. Where are you kind of in that state?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've gotten a little bit of everything. So, and you often end up getting feedback that you didn't even expect, which is great because all of a sudden you're being
Yeah,
like, man, I never even thought about that. I didn't even know that
good
was
point.
possible. And one of those things actually was we started off with a Kickstarter. And so by nature, Kickstarter aggregates people from all sorts of
Yeah,
backgrounds. I mean, there's really not a lot of targeting. We ran ads to generate interest for the Kickstarter, so we had our focus areas, but Kickstarter itself is not like here's your customer profile or here's your sport or personality. I mean,
it's like take
there's
everybody.
people that weren't even athletes that just like new tech and like, I just want to see this new gadget kind of thing. So lots of different use cases, lots of different feedback, which was good. Um, and we're still, in the process of sorting out who exactly is the best use case and who does this fit in uh, best for, as well as understanding that, we're not the only palm cooling product out there. There's 7 or 8 other ones. And there's variances in approach to palm cooling, as well as variances in how you can approach it doing DIY. So we have our product and our form factor, and how does that best fit into, a specific sport or or use case? And so we're working on that, and definitely some strong indicators we've seen where we're really looking to double down on has been baseball, has been one, especially in the sports medicine side and with starting pitchers in the dugout. It's a really good use case for all the reasons we talked about
I would
before.
say that's the best. That's got to be like some of the best timing in between
It's
in between
it's
sessions.
perfect, right? Because you have those dedicated breaks in the dugout, hot environments, and guys throwing hard and throwing high intensity. And now in the pitch clock era, there's not as much rest, so they're up there. And if a guy ends up having a bad inning or there's a couple walks or something like that, I mean, you could be up there, for a decent amount of time. And then what can be really tough for starting pitchers if they're up there, maybe they have to throw 20, 30 pitches one inning. And then, they get back to the dugout and it's 3 up, 3 down with a couple ground balls or
Yeah,
something. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, you're back up there.
back
Like,
out.
no break for you. So that's been good. And I think the other one that we're probably most excited about right now, or at least I am, is tennis. And I mean, it's been in the news for the heat, but it's also great because it's super high intensity with these short little breaks in between, and typically in hot environments. I mean, just about every tournament is,
Yeah,
there's some
outside.
headline
Yeah,
from the Australian Open through the French Open, going on. There's just been hot, 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 and you got these little breaks. So I think that's a really good use case. And then you could lump in the broader racket sports as well, pickleball in there, paddle in there, squash and other ones like that, just because they're just really nicely structured with high intensity. Heat is a real significant issue, and you have these short, intermittent breaks throughout, which is nice. And then in our case, they don't have long, maybe they get 90 seconds, grab a towel, wipe down their face, grab a water bottle. Our product is smaller in one hand, which is an advantage, I think, for us in that specific use case, as opposed to if you had something that was bigger or bulkier. Because I mean, they're going to be drinking water, they're going to be using a towel and whatnot. There's very limited window for intervention during those breaks. So that's definitely something we're seeing as well.
awesome. That's good to hear. And then where can the athletes, listeners, viewers, where can they find the product? How do they get it? All that good stuff.
Yeah, so the main ways to find us would be our website, which is getcooler.com, and then on socials on Instagram we're at getcooler as well. And then anyone can reach out to me as well. I don't know if you can put in my email or my LinkedIn or anything, but
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
I'll talk to anyone and answer any questions, and I usually respond to everyone as fast as I can. So that should be mostly comprehensive for anyone looking for more.
I love it. And before we go, I always love to hear kind of the story behind the name. So how did you get to Cooler? Because how'd you get the name, and how'd you kind of go about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question actually. When I had the idea for this, when I heard the Dr. Heller interview with Huberman, I was in Austria at the time, and I'd been studying German, so cooler, which I'm not even saying it remotely right. It's like
Yeah,
cooler. is a German word, and the definition of it is radiator, which in essence is what this is. This is a radiator. The second definition is also cooler, like cooler, so
Yeah.
it also sort of fits. So that was one half of it. I was like, that's kind of a cool name. And then part of it was like, I thought the umlauts, over the U were cool because it's different, and you see some brands kind of doing it. I was like, that's cool. I like that. It also helps that people say cooler, and so it creates so many puns. I mean, it's impossible to go a conversation without someone being like, "Oh, hey, I just had a pun there." And then the other thought was, I remember reading, well, different articles about it, but also Shoe Dog with Phil Knight when they ended up getting to Nike. And there's this thing about a lot of strong brands having two syllables and a strong sound like a K. There's just something about it where it just sounds good. It sounds authoritative and whatnot. So it just happened to check all those boxes. It was somewhat spontaneous, but went with it and liked it and kept it.
Yeah, no, I love it. Like I said, and just dabbling in German myself, I think that's what stuck out to me when I first came across your profile. I was like, that's for sure a German word. What's this guy doing
Uh,
out here? And then that's how I initially reached out.
yeah, so it's a homage to Austria, which was where I was when I had the idea and did my first testing. So
I
gotta
love it.
gotta gotta show love.
Of course, of course. Before we go, I don't know if there's anything we missed or anything you want to touch on. I like to give the guests kind of the floor here before we close, so I'll let you take over here.
Oh, well, I don't think so. Well, I guess I would just say I'm grateful for letting you, or from having you let me share the story and the origin of it and a little bit about what the product is. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I'm open to talk to anyone who's curious, and that includes not just the product and the business side, on the founding and business development and what we're doing, but also just on, science and anyone looking forward, just thinking about thermoregulation and human performance, conversations of the sort. DIY ways, I'm happy to just help out whoever I can because I've spent the last few years just living in the world of thermoregulation and cooling. So it's fun. It's a passion of mine. So I'm more than happy to just meet with anyone and help out whoever I can, however I can.
Yeah, no, I love it. Especially the DIY. You got me thinking. So that's a good point there. And like you said, anyone reach out, hit him up. Very very quick to respond, and he's building a very cool product. And so obviously, thanks for coming on today, and everyone for listening and joining for another episode of the Constant Sports Podcast. And if anything jumped out, obviously reach out to Braeden. Go check out Kühler Technologies, kind of what they're building, how they're going. Obviously, they're kind of in their second wave of releasing some of the products here, and so especially the athletes tap in. And I'll be sending this to a lot of my athlete buddies and all those athletes out there. And so, thanks again, Braeden, for coming on, and we'll see you guys next week.
Hey, thanks, Connor. I appreciate it.